Dears, and welcome to the Disability Dramaturgy series on this channel where I break down disability in the theater canon. I'm your host, Sydney, pronouns they, them. I'm a white young person with light brown shoulder-length curly hair. I'm wearing a blue striped polo shirt, and I discovered this morning while putting on this shirt that I am dysphoric in polos. So the more you learn. Thank you to the boys section of Kohl's for having this for $12. And I also have a wrist brace on my right wrist because I'm not making a fake cast for this purpose, but I had to do a little more cosplay than just the shirt, and I'm sitting in front of a plain wall that has green leaves on it. I very much told you all in my Tommy video last month that we were going to do Hunchback this month, but did you know that Hunchback has over 50 different adaptations and the book is a 22-hour long audiobook? And then I ended up with too many research holes still, and so then I have to schedule interviews and stuff to talk to people, which is taking a really long time. So I moved that to next month and decided to do a simpler one with significantly less history this time around to give that one a little bit more time to figure itself out, because there's a lot happening there and I'm very overwhelmed. Also, it's kind of nice to like mix up disabilities, because if I'd done that one I would have been doing 2 deaf related shows in a row. So let's say that was the plan rather than I bit off more than I can chew. Anywho, today we're going to talk about Dear Evan Hansen, and if you somehow don't know the plot of that yet, I don't know how you don't know it, but good for you. It does contain significant conversations around mental illness, mental health, and self-murder. So as always, I'm going to keep it as light as possible, but this is a dark show, so be forewarned, it is totally okay if you need to skip this one. The other disclaimer that I want to give in advance is that these videos are always a cool that happened now what situation to teach about the legacy of disability on stage and how that creates what we see today, as well as ideas on how to mitigate harm that happened in the past in future stagings of these productions. And one thing that I've noticed in research for this video in particular is that people simply refuse to acknowledge that Dear Evan Hansen is fundamentally a period piece, and we cannot feasibly judge the original production through a modern day lens because mental health conversations have changed exponentially since this opened in 2016. I know that it did run until 2022. That's a different conversation. We're not going to get into that here. We will be getting into the movie though. Don't worry about that. But keep in mind that this show had its first workshop just a few months after it became possible for people to get both an autism and ADHD diagnosis, just to like put it in perspective of psychology history. So even though it does feel like 2016 was definitely last year in our brains, it very much was not. And we will get into this more later, but that is a good thing to keep in mind from the start. Also, my audience is generally super nice, but I just want to cover my bases. I know the internet likes to complain about Ben Platt for some reason. He's wonderful, and I will not tolerate that behavior in my comments, so not gonna do that. Anyway, so let's begin with the plot. So the show opens on Evan, a 17-year-old boy who struggles with severe social anxiety and depression. Also now his arm is in a cast because he broke it when he fell out of a tree all by himself, and it was very sad. Also, I should note, he falls out of a tree at the state park where he is an apprentice park ranger over the summer, and I know the national park system a little bit too well, and we won't get into why, but that's not a thing. Apprentice park rangers are not things. That's not a thing that exists. There's also a line later in the show where they mention biking the Appalachian Trail, which is also not a thing, and the word hike is right there, which is the thing that you can do on the Appalachian Trail, and it's not that big of a deal, but to me it is, because this is why dramaturgs are important, because they'll point those things out for you. Anyway, his therapist recently told him to start writing letters to himself being like, "Dear Evan Hansen, today's gonna be a good day and here's why," to try to help build up some confidence and help him with his anxiety. So the show opens on him writing one of those letters. We then meet Evan's mother, who is working full-time as a nurse but also going to school for legal stuff, so she is very busy and has a hard time making time for Evan. Today is the first day of school, and she suggests to him that he could try to make friends by asking people to sign his cast. We then see the Murphy household, which is mom, dad, brother, Connor, sister Zoe, all at the breakfast table. Connor is Evan's age and really depressed, also constantly high. I would argue there's more mental health stuff going on than those two things, but whatever. He's fighting with his mom, and the parents are sort of fighting with each other also. And this song is called Anybody Have a Map? It's sung by the two moms trying to figure out how to raise and connect with their sons who seem just out of reach. We then go to school, where we meet the two other characters, Alana and Jared. Alana is the stereotypical class president doing a gazillion clubs all the time, but doesn't know how to do human communication, and also doesn't have any friends but craves connection anyway kind of person. And then Jared is Evan's sorta not really friend who insists on being called a family friend, who's just chaos incarnate. And then Connor shows up, Evan laughs awkwardly, Connor's like, "Oh, so you think I'm a freak," and yells at him and pushes him to the ground. And then sister Zoe, who Evan has major crush on, comes in to apologize for her brother's behavior, and then Evan completely short circuits, and then he hates himself for being really awkward, and then we get the song Waving Through a Window, which statistically, you know. He then goes to the library to finish typing up his letter to himself for his therapy appointment later, and his letter to himself is very, I feel very alone. Everything will always be terrible forever because it always has been, and the only thing that I'm hopeful about is Zoe, and I don't even know her. I just wish things were different, because if I disappeared tomorrow, would anybody really notice? Sincerely, your best and most dearest friend. That, and then he prints that out. I don't know why he couldn't have handwritten, well, I guess he isn't a cast, so I'll give him that. Anyway, he prints it out and he goes to the printer to grab it, but then he runs into Connor, who seems like maybe he feels a little bit bad for pushing him earlier, so he tries to make like light conversation and asks if he can sign Evan's cast, and so he does, and he covers the whole thing with his name, and it's very funny. And then things seem to be chill, but then he finds Evan's letter on the printer, he sees Zoe's name on it, he freaks out, and then he runs with the letter, and Evan starts to panic because that was obviously a really personal letter that could definitely be used against him. Now, after a few days of waiting for Connor to like post on the internet or otherwise humiliate him, that hasn't happened, and he's kind of stressed. But then Evan gets called to the principal's office where Connor's parents are there, and Evan is like, what is going on? And they're like, we're Connor's parents. Connor wanted you to have this letter, and they hand him his own letter, and they're like, we didn't know that Connor had any friends. And then they say that Connor had taken his life a few days earlier, and they assume that this is his suicide note. And Evan tries to explain, no, that's not, no, but the parents keep trying to like push back against him, and they don't really give him the space to speak. And then they see Connor's name on his cast, and they're like, aha, proof, you guys were friends. And so then he panics, and then they invite him over for dinner, and he talks to Jared like, what do I do? Like, I need to tell them the truth, this is awful. And Jared is like, well, you really don't want to take away the one thing that they feel like they have that's left of their son, right? Like, you're gonna be the actual worst if you do that. And he's like, oh, okay. And so Jared tells him to just nod and smile and don't say anything else to incriminate himself, just nod along and then, you know, have the situation be over after that. So he goes to this dinner and he nods along, and he ends up word vomiting and telling them all the things that he thinks that they want to hear, which then ends up in him telling a story about how he broke his arm and saying that it was actually at the old orchard that he and Connor used to hang out at, and he fell out of the tree there, and then Connor was there to help him. So we start to see that this lie is not just comforting the family, but it's also starting to like comfort Evan as well, because he's creating an alternate reality for himself. Anyway, so he basically says that they used to communicate via a secret email account, and then realizes the parents are going to ask for the emails, so then he and Jared team up to write a bunch of fake emails from a now dead kid to give to the Murphys, hoping that maybe this will be the end of it. But then Evan accidentally says to the mom that there are more emails when there aren't, and so she asks for the more emails, and he's like, okay. And then he goes and writes more emails, and they're writing emails throughout basically the entirety of the show. And then we have the song Requiem, which might be my favorite from, not necessarily from a musical perspective, because musical perspective, it's a lot of different songs, but from a narrative perspective, I think this probably is one of my favorites, if not my favorite, because it juxtaposes the three remaining Murphy family members and how they aren't going to mourn Connor tonight. And the dad, it's because he feels like his son took his privileged life for granted. The mom, because she feels like her son's still around now that she has the emails. And Zoe, because he was a monster to her and she's not as upset about it as people think she should be, because he wasn't a good guy. Then we have some mini scenes where we learn about how students at the school are kind of capitalizing off of Connor's death and like using it as a way to like talk to each other and make profit. And then we also learn that Evan's mom promised to take off work one night to make tacos with him, but then completely forgot about it, and so he has to like pretend that he's cool with it, but then he goes over to the Murphys for dinner instead. And while he's there, he sits in Connor's room, and Zoe comes in and asks him why Connor would say what he said in the note about her. And so Evan is like, well, yeah, he cared for you so much. He thought you were really awesome. And she's like, really? And he's like, absolutely, yeah. And then he starts listing all the things that he has personally noticed about her, that he really likes about her, in a way that's like, no, your brother totally noticed these things, when obviously he didn't. And then at the end of the song, he impulsively tries to kiss her on her dead brother's bed, and then she pulls away and runs off. So Evan goes home and he's like, I've ruined everything. What have I done? But then Alana's really upset about how people aren't talking about Connor anymore, and they want to keep his memory alive. And so then Evan decides to create the Connor Project, which is a project meant to keep Connor's memory going, but also like provide resources about mental health issues and all of this kind of stuff, which Jared and Alana agree to help run. And then they go to the Murphy parents to pitch this idea to them, saying they're going to run a kickoff assembly where people can speak about Connor. And the mom ends up giving Evan one of Connor's ties that he never got to wear for this assembly so that he can speak about Connor. And Evan's like, I don't do public speaking. And she's like, well, no, but you were Connor's best friend. Everybody's expecting you to speak. And he's like, okay, sounds good. So then he goes and he does a speech, but his note cards get all scrambled and he starts to have a panic attack, but then he pulls himself together and then he gives what is supposedly a really great speech based on lies, and then that goes viral on the internet and he gets tons of traction on their page. This is the song You Will Be Found. Also during this song, like the dad finally cries and the parents like hug each other, and it's like, oh, all of this healing and love is happening because of this lie. And then at the end of it, Zoe thanks Evan for giving her brother back, and she kisses him, and then it's intermission. And at this moment, I'm gonna take off this brace because I don't like wearing arm braces anymore, and I don't need to anymore, so we're taking it off. It was fun for the bit while it lasted. Okay, so Act 2 opens on Alana pitching the concept of a Kickstarter campaign to raise $50,000 to restore the abandoned apple orchard that Evan and Connor used to hang out in. I really don't think that's how apple orchards work. I have a lot of questions about how this money is going to be helpful and who's going to be hired and like what the situation is and how it's sustainable, but sure, cool, amazing, whatever, suspension of disbelief, this is theater, we love to see it. We then see Evan and Jared writing more emails, and Jared tries to write himself into the emails and Evan stops him and is like, you need to stick to the story, and then Evan's mom goes to him kind of upset that she learned about his friendship with Connor via seeing a video of his speech on Facebook rather than learning it from him directly, and they have a big fight, and then he runs off to the Murphy's house afterwards where he hangs out with the dad because they're like his surrogate family at this point, and the dad teaches him how to break in a baseball glove because that's just like peak dad behavior, I guess. I don't know. And then at one point he says like, oh, your dad must be so proud to have a son like you, and Evan's like, yeah, he is, and then he pauses and then he comes clean and he's like, nope, my dad left my family and doesn't really care about me. And this is the first time that we see Evan actually come clean about a lie to anyone. Then he and Zoe hang out and he tries to talk to her about the Connor project because let's be real, it's his new special interest. And she's like, no, I want the you and the me stuff to be not about Connor, please, because my whole life has been about Connor. And then they sing a song called Only Us, and I just have to say, seeing a performance of this when I was younger, like many years ago, was the first time I'd ever seen a couple where one of them struggled with eye contact before, and it literally rewired my brain chemistry. After this moment, Evan becomes really focused on Zoe stuff because he's like, oh my gosh, I finally got the girl, and he leaves behind his family and his sort of friends and the Connor project, and everybody starts to get mad at him. And then he goes to the Murphys with Zoe to find that they had invited his mother over for dinner, at which point they offered to give Evan the college fund that they'd had for Connor, and the mom gets really embarrassed and goes home, and then they get in another really massive fight, and then we get the song Good For You, which is an entire banger, where his mom and Jared and Alana are all like, screw you, you self-centered prick, which is well deserved. I think this is a very important song to exist. And then we see Evan contemplating coming clean about everything in a discussion with a vision of Connor. I forgot to mention that. He like has Connor's like inside of his brain, sort of, and so he shows up throughout and they like have conversations with each other. But anyway, he's like, no more lies, I can't handle this anymore, I don't want to do it anymore. But the vision of Connor convinces him to continue the lie because if he ends it, he's gonna lose everything. And he also like yells at Evan for not even being able to accept the truth that he didn't fall out of the tree, he jumped out of the tree, which, for the record, not a super effective way to try to die, but sure, you do you, bestie. Now, Alana confronts Evan being like, I don't care about the Connor project anymore. Also, I don't think you two were actually friends and you lied about the emails. And he's like, I can prove it. And he gives her the supposed suicide note. And Alana's like, this is how we raise the rest of the money. And so she makes the decision to post what she thinks is a guy's suicide note on the internet. And then it goes viral, and Evan panics, but she's not going to take it down. And then the internet starts to blame Connor's family for what he did and becomes really mean, and the family gets doxxed. It's a whole situation, and Evan goes over to them to try to comfort them or something, and everybody's fighting, and he just completely falls apart, and he tells the truth about all of it, completely just like melting into pieces as he does, and they tell him to leave, and he goes home in shambles where his mom is right there, and she apologizes for not seeing how much he'd been hurting, and he's like, I didn't tell you that I'd been hurting, and she's like, you shouldn't have had to, which, very good moment, very good dialogue. 10 out of 10 for that moment. And then she sings to him about how she will always be there for him when he most needs her. Then we fast forward to a year later, and instead of going to college, Evan is living at home. He's taking some community college classes. He's working. He's also like getting better in regards to his mental health struggles. And then he meets up with Zoe at the now completed, refurbished, whatever you want to call it, orchard, and apologizes again for the pain that he's caused, and she forgives him, saying that the lie was kind of what the family needed in the moment, and they have a heartfelt mutual thanks, I guess. Everything was weird last time we knew each other, but you know, it happened. And then Evan does another letter to himself where he's like, today's gonna be a good day because you're you and you're not hiding or lying anymore, you're just you. And that is the show. The original staging is on the more minimalist side with just like a handful of furniture pieces to signify different locations, and then there's lots of screens around, which makes it feel kind of like the online and social media aspects are just as real as everything else is. It also tends to move around Evan, so it feels like the events are happening to him rather than him like deliberately seeking out, you know, being a manipulative liar. It's actually not dissimilar in visual structure to The Who's Tommy, interestingly enough. I keep finding similarities between different shows I've studied for the series, and I don't know if that's because there's a specific legacy of disability and mental health related shows that is inherently linked, or if just like it's a phenomenon with all of theater and I'm only now noticing because I'm looking at it. Probably both. But yeah, so the project initially began with the composers Ben Pasek and Justin Paul, and when Pasek was in high school, a student who wasn't super popular died of an overdose, and then suddenly everybody started claiming some sort of like connection to him, and they wanted to examine that. And the initial idea was from like a sort of a sinister lens about how like self-centered people are, and particularly in reference to social media, which is just becoming a thing when this idea began, how that amplifies the situation and the idea of the me generation. That idea later expanded with help of book writer Stephen Levinson to be more of a look into the why of this phenomenon, like how people want to be a part of these communal experiences as a result of isolation and loneliness, which is now only being made worse by social media, and thus they decided to head more into the like heartstrings humanity direction than the dark comedy Heather's direction with their story, focusing on the very human need for connection, especially when dealing with grief, with some added conversation around social media and inevitably mental health. And after working on it for many years, it went through several readings in 2014, a workshop in 2015, followed by the stage premiere at the Arena Stage in DC, and then running off Broadway at Second Stage, later transferring to the Music Box Theater on Broadway. And for some historical context, it opened less than a month after Trump was elected for the first time, and it ran from 2016 until 2022. And if you want to learn more about the creative team and the creative process, they have a book called Through the Window that's only like a 3-ish hour audiobook, and it teaches you a lot about how much work and time goes into crafting a show, and also crafting this show in particular. Really well put together, really interesting. I highly recommend checking it out. Now, speaking of books, 2 years after the show's Broadway opening, followed by winning approximately a gazillion Tony Awards, and that is the technical number, writer Val Emmich, apologies if I pronounced that incorrectly, turned the story into a YA novel, and it is good. Like, it is good, will be going out to find a physical copy of it to own and read again at some point, level good. And something that we're going to talk about later is the legacy of autistic coding across different mediums. Like, autistic coding as a narrative tool is used and expressed differently in film versus in books versus on stage, and that's actually part of why the musical was so successful and the film was not. But this novel seems to be rather aware of the legacy around writing mental illness and writing autistic coded characters specifically, because it perfectly locks in with the narrative voice that we associate with autistic characters. It's not so matter-of-fact and slightly dehumanized as like the autism voice that we see in books like Counting by Sevens or Rain Rain, that was kind of around, you know, the 2010s middle grade writing disability craze. It sits a little bit more toward the Curious Incident or the Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close style, kind of. Like, it has Evan describing how he feels about things and how he interacts with the world kind of in the way Percy Jackson or Hank Zipser does. It's more in that realm, in a way that is very distinctly recognizable as a mentally disabled narrative, if that makes any sense at all whatsoever. Now, putting Evan's story into this format takes away a lot of the "dude, why are you doing that? What's wrong with you?" feelings you sometimes have when watching the show, because you're literally inside of his brain seeing how he makes decisions, and you realize that those decisions were the right and logical thing for him at the time, even if they aren't the objectively right ones from the outside, which gives you a lot more compassion for this character, where you're still viscerally angry at him for what he's done, but you also get to see how he got from point A to point B, and then from point B to point C, and then from point C to point D, to all the way end up at point Z, and you understand how that happened, you know? We also have an expectation with books that they're generally going to follow one or maybe two primary characters, so it no longer feels like the whole story is disjointedly around Evan, who is the star of the piece, but more like a regular kid who's given a journal and started writing his story down, which completely changes the tone. And also, we're very used to, one, reading books with semi-unreliable narrators, being able to see through how the narrator sees everything and see what's actually going on beyond that person's perspective, and who people actually are beyond what that person thinks they're like. Evan's world is painted the same in the book as in the musical. Both times it's through his lens, but we don't entirely realize in the musical that it is being filtered through that way, and so we're more likely to look at it objectively, which isn't the fault of the musical's writing. This is literally just how theater works as a medium in comparison to written text. It also lets you see how truly debilitating his social anxiety is, how every task takes 15 extra steps in his brain to be able to accomplish a thing, and how exhausting that is. And it's also very clear that this kid is just like racked with internalized ableism. He keeps talking about how he's broken, how he's not right, how he's a disappointment, how he needs fixing, all of these things. But you also see how, well, yes, half to 3/4 of that is a brain difference. He also isn't willing to put in any of the work to try to be less miserable because he's too scared to be vulnerable in that way. And also really almost overly relies on constantly taking Ativan on top of his daily medications to get by. But instead of affirming these ableist views of mental illness in the text that he has for himself, you see how that matches his tone across the board of being pessimistic about everything. And then at the end, when he decides to put in the effort to actually work to feel better, he starts to feel better and reflects on what he's learned and changes his mind about these internalized ableist things he felt about himself and tries to do better, not just for him, but also like for the people around him. And in expanding his mother's character as well, we start to see her as the autistic coded parent of the autistic kid who has literally no idea how to socialize with him and wants to try, but the fact that she is physically unable to be there a lot of the time makes that even worse, which makes their dynamic feel a lot more natural and authentic rather than just like angsty teenager doesn't like mom who also isn't around a lot. And the other thing that I love about the book is what they do with Connor. In the show, we really only get to see Connor as created by Evan. We don't see who he truly is beyond that one very short scene at the beginning. And in the book, we get the point of view of his ghost, kind of watching what's going on afterwards and giving his own commentary on what actually happened or what he regrets doing. First of all, because we get a whole lot of him looking at Evan and being like, what the heck is this random guy doing? But also because Evan and Connor are meant to sort of be two different directions of the same situation that mirror each other, and they leaned into that more here in the book, particularly with the moment after the words fail scene when Evan tells Connor's family the truth, and he goes into the street and he curls into a ball and vaguely hopes to get hit by a car, and Connor's ghost yells at him, "You need to get up and own it, you can't just ignore it like I did." And it frames the choice to live through horrible things and try to take care of yourself as the brave choice. But also without framing Connor's choice as cowardly, which I think is important and well crafted, but just rather as something that he like kind of regrets doing, or at least wants to prevent somebody else from making the same decision that he did. And thus the consequences that Evan faces are the reality of having to live with what he did for the rest of his life. And you see how that impacts him. Like, he starts out being like, I'm the scum of the earth and I never deserve to feel joy again, and how he preferred the naive loneliness from before he knew what it felt like to not feel as alone. But then he kind of gets to like I've hit rock bottom and I'm never gonna do that again. And I'm gonna break this cycle of harm that's going on. So like, what he did doesn't ruin the rest of his life because the story trusts him to realize that what he did was wrong and try to do what he can, not to rectify it because that's impossible, though things have been done, but to sort of make reparations for the harm that he caused. And so he starts to put in a lot of work when he's in therapy. He quits the Connor Project to protect that legacy because he expected the Connor family to expose him, even though they never do. He reads through all of Connor's favorite books. He anonymously donates to the Connor Project whenever he's able, and he learns all he can about who Connor actually was, which he then later shares with the Murphy family, which was written in such a beautiful way that made it clear that this will never fix everything, but he's doing his damn hardest to try at least to be a better person going forward, which I really respect. And it also, like, you could see how much Evan had grown as a person from start to finish of this story. The other thing about Ghost Connor is that we learned that he did actually have a real friend, a friend named Miguel, who was the first openly gay person that Connor had ever met, and Connor is bi but still sorting that out. And they kind of fall for each other, but in the way that like awkward high school crushes go unspoken, you know? And they used to like smoke a lot of weed together, and then Miguel got caught with the weed and he was going to be expelled, and Connor decided to take the fall for it and get expelled instead, and then get sent off to rehab, which he mentions was super traumatic for him and made him worse. And he also mentions at one point that he was sent to a wilderness therapy program earlier in his life. Those are notoriously abusive. I have a video about them up here if you want to learn more about the troubled teen industry. But the fact that they mentioned that in there, I was like, ah, very good, because he gives the energy of he's traumatized from the care that his family tried to give him. But then a misunderstanding between him and Miguel is what ends up being one of the final factors that leads him to end his own life, which again furthers the parallel between Evan and Connor both doing a not so great thing because they could rationalize it as the right thing, and then that had serious consequences, and one of them chooses to die and the other one chooses to live. And it also kind of demonstrates how, like, sure, Connor's parents sort of failed him, but so did the system that was supposed to help him that his parents were trying to put him into, you know? My one note would be that they should not have specified specifically how Connor died, even though it was the most logical way that he would have done it, but I also don't think that that specific piece was necessary, sheerly from like it's one thing to mention suicide in a piece for young people and another thing to talk about the hyper specifics of the actual event situation. I think the rest of the story very much shows that it's not the way to go, and that scene was in there particularly to have a parallel where Evan's mom sees Connor in the hospital, but I personally just wouldn't have included that. Or like, even if they wanted that hospital parallel, they could have just done that without specifying precisely what happened, but that's just me being nitpicky. But the main question that I have about the book is like, how much of that stuff is already canon in the musical they just didn't have space to write it in there, and so they knew what they were saying and doing, but as an audience we don't, and so we've been critiquing stuff that actually did have answers. They're just not answers in the media that we ended up seeing. Because just watching the musical as its own thing, detached from everything else, I have a lot of issues to point out. But watching it after reading the book, I see how most of the things I would point out to critique are actually quite logical and reasonable. They just had to cut things for time's sake and ended up cutting them in a way that became an issue when it exists in a vacuum. And my guess would be a mix of the two, because I guarantee you that some of the fixing of the criticisms in the book did come from, oh, we were criticized for this, let's fix it in the next iteration. And also because the actors are portraying things differently. I mean, obviously they're different actors in later productions, but they're inhabiting the characters in a way that is more similar to the book after it was published than they were before it was published, which I think is interesting. But I also know as a creator, I have pages and pages of notes on characters and backstories that will never see the light of day. And that's for a project I don't even have a plot for yet, so I cannot even imagine what kinds of content they had laying around after nearly a decade of working on the show that then ended up getting cut from the show and found its way into the book. But that then brings us back to the musical itself, where you're limited by runtime, specifically because songs take up about half of it, and there's only so much factual information that you can cram in there. And then there was a deliberate effort with this show to make the songs somewhat on the poppier side, which really lends itself to emotional depth, but not necessarily as much storytelling factual depth. And that's fine. I really think the music is what a lot of people gravitate toward about this piece, but it does mean that the show has more emotional depth than it does plot or character depth, which again is how theater works as a medium, so I can't quite be mad at it for that. But to throw a third medium in here, let's talk about the 2021 film, which took approximately no inspiration from the book except a small portion of the Evan works to honor Connor's legacy after realizing he really messed up situation at the end. After they have him post on Instagram that he lied and then we never see the repercussions of that, I don't understand why that was there. I think that should have been cut. Also, hilarious bonus points, because they made one of Connor's top 10 favorite books be The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime. I saw that. I very much clocked that. Thank you, because correct. Now, when the film was released, the entire internet was very keen on clowning on it, much like we've seen recently with Mean Girls, so I had a lot of expectations going into it. Really, the thing is that it suffers from the same situation most musicals adapted into film have been struggling with, which is not being quite sure if it's a movie or if it's a musical, and then kind of apologizing for that fact, and so that it ends up just being really meh, which then makes people start to really question and tear apart the original source material solely because the adaptation quality was sketchy at best, and this film in particular was already really hindered by the fact that, and people don't really notice this if they don't work in disability studies or in the medical field, but mental health conversations change fast. Like, half of my channel is already super outdated and I've only been doing this for 3 years fast. And the combination of TikTok's rise to power and the pandemic throwing everybody online for social connection in 2020 made it move in even hyper speed, which would, in theory, make a story about social media's impact on daily life and mental health be even more relevant. In fact, I'm quite convinced that's what the creators of this film thought was going to be the case. But the way that we discuss and think about mental illness between the creation of this story and honestly the time between when the thing was filmed and when it was released completely changed. And I don't think I can entirely quantifiably tell you what that change is, but it is significant and it is quite noticeable. And I say this with much commiseration. Like, this is one of the reasons I've stopped trying to write representation, because I know that anything I would make would not only age terribly once released to the world, but I'd also have to rewrite it entirely like 100 million times over the decade it takes a piece to get from concept to Broadway. So if you're wondering why theater is usually behind in regards to humor or minority representation, this is one of the main reasons, because that's how long shows take in process. So I majorly cut them some slack on how outdated this movie feels. I also know that the energy in the film is very low and some of the chemistry feels really weird because they filmed during COVID restrictions. So that also is going to mess up what film that we get. And I completely understand that and cut them slack for that. There are other choices that are less easily understandable to me, like the fact that Connor's dad is now his stepfather. I don't know why that happened. It's also clearly wanted to center Evan more, and adapting a musical into a film requires cutting some songs for time because films are generally shorter than the average musical runs, but that means that they ended up cutting the majority of the numbers that weren't Evan solos, which creates a universe where Evan is kind of the only one who really sings, which I think could have been interesting if they really leaned into that. Like, the concept of having a character who is an outsider because they communicate completely differently is really interesting, but that's definitely not what the goal was here. They also kept trying to sort of break the fourth wall by having characters look into the camera. That's really hard to pull off. They definitely didn't quite pull it off. They also made it less of a comedy. Like, Dear Evan Hansen is not, objectively not a comedy, but it has a lot of of very funny moments and very light moments, a lot of which were cut here or just like restaged here, which makes you sit in the reality of what's happening a bit more and then question it a bit more. And in case you haven't noticed, the premise of this story is very weird, so the more that you think about it while it's happening, the less on board with the story you're going to end up being, you know? Also, as we mentioned earlier, in the show, the set moves around Evan, which takes away a lot of his agency, but that's not how the film works, so it required Evan going to the Murphy's house and doing all of these things, which meant that what he did felt a whole lot more calculated. And in general, you can get away with things in live theater that you cannot in film in the sense of narrative moments for a whole ton of reasons. The biggest one being like suspension of disbelief is a lot higher in theater than it is in film. They also took out Ghost Connor, which made him feel even weirder as a character because we literally never see him again. Though again, I also understand why including him in that manner would be very complicated in a film in a way that it just isn't on stage. There's also the wonderful Ben Platt, who I don't think was necessarily too old for the role. Colton playing Connor was only a year or two younger than Ben at the time. There were just hair, makeup, costuming, lighting, camera angle, design choices that when all combined made many of the characters feel rather uncanny valley in relation to their backgrounds in a slightly disconcerting way. You just notice it more with Evan because he's the focal point of the piece, but it genuinely felt like, and this is not the fault of the cast, it felt like half of the cast was designed to look like they were wearing stage makeup and acting on a stage, and the other half were designed for film makeup and acting in a film, which are two completely different situations, which made it feel disjointed and odd. Like literally a year before this, Ben Platt played a believable high schooler in The Politician, so it's not like this is completely out of the blue. It also doesn't help that his vocal style does tend to be more on the vibrato-y side rather than straight tone, which just sounds older stylistically for many reasons, so that didn't help the situation. I've also seen some people say that part of what aged Ben up was his Evan physicality. I very much think that a huge part of the reason that that physicality makes people uncomfortable is because people are not used to seeing autistic-coded physicality or autistic disabled physicality in general that is outside the realm of cutesy and quirky or like the weird genius. His physicality and his stims and all that kind of stuff are not the conventionally attractive ones, and I really respect that choice, but it does make people feel uncomfortable around it, and that's just a little bit of ableism. And again, it's also majorly the design choices, because a lot of this physicality is fairly similar to how Ben's physicality is in Pitch Perfect 2. Not so much in the first film, but it is very much there in the second one. But we're only used to seeing this kind of physicality in a comedic setting, which we then process as physical humor, and outside of a comedic setting, and when it's supposed to feel real, it starts to short-circuit our brains and make us feel uncomfortable, because that's when the ableism starts to kick in and we realize that we're uncomfortable looking at disabled people. Anywho, that brings us to the next thing about this film, which is we're used to seeing autistic coded and even explicitly autistic characters on screen at this point. There is a long legacy of us existing in its capacity, and there are somewhat expected norms as to how that is portrayed or handled. And you can see that they tried to somewhat do that here a little bit, like with the waving through a window sequence, they included a lot of quickly changing snapshots in a very Temple Grandin manner. They also made the Sharpie that Connor wrote on Evan's cast with very loud and squeaky, which made that moment all the more awkward and unsettling. So there were breadcrumbs, and on one level, I almost want to applaud them for generally not following the various structures of representing neurodivergence on screen that we've come to expect, but it also slightly backfires because it makes the film feel even more unsure of how it wants to present Evan as a person and as a character, and I think that that hurts our chances of liking and sympathizing with him even more. And if they had used some of the tools that we've seen with other films that show point of view of mentally disabled people, I think it would have framed itself a lot better. Some examples just off the top of my head. Temple Grandin does it really well. I have issues with the film, but it does it really well. I Am Sam does it really well. Benny and June is another example. Jack of the Red Hearts is a little weird, but that one also works. Like, there's different ways that we see this portrayed. Anyway, that's a whole other discussion for another day. Let's talk about autistic coding for a second, because I keep mentioning that concept and not really elaborating on it. I read Evan as autistic. Most people read Evan as autistic. He really walks the fine line between it's just really bad social anxiety and it's autism. I very much think it can be both, and it is both. And a lot of the arguments that specifically say Evan isn't autistic are based on massive misunderstandings of what autism actually looks like and is. In Through the Window, there is a quote from a 2011 email from book writer Levinson into Pasek and Paul, and forgive me, my punctuation on this is wonky. I couldn't find the PDF version of the book to check the quote beyond the audiobook, but it said, "It's not Asperger's at all. It's sort of the opposite even. He feels a tremendous amount and wants to be close to people. He's just awkward and uncomfortable in his own skin." And again, literally no judgment here. This is how theater people talk about mental disability today, and this email was written before Asperger's was removed from the DSM, so I completely understand where this is coming from. But I would argue that this proves that they did know from day one that Evan was autistic. They just didn't understand what autism actually was, because this quote is based on the assumption that autism means liking to be alone, being comfortable being alone, and not feeling a lot or wanting to be near people, when it can very much be the exact opposite of those things. I very much am the exact opposite of many of those things. We also see neurodivergent speech patterns and habits in the script, such as unreliable speech, where he thinks one thing but his body says another, and when every actor who plays his character embodies these lines, they become even more autistic coded, with atypical prosody, which are the tone, rhythm, and stress patterns of speech. We see him speak way too quickly, or have his voice crack or tone change at atypical points, or have slightly odd vocal rhythms. If you want to learn more about neurodivergent speech patterns, I have a video up here. And then we also have the physicality, and this is very interesting to me because I know firsthand how weird of a situation this is to pull off, whether playing an autistic coded character or deliberately trying to play autism on stage. The way that theater is structured, everybody has to emote in an over-the-top way or otherwise use their physicality to denote what's going on more than we expect from film, because in film you can see people's facial expressions up close, which is just not a guaranteed in theater. So this means that the physicality you might do in a film that would indicate that somebody is in any way different will read on stage as just normal, everyday, every person, all the time physicality. So while both mediums use autistic coding as a narrative shortcut for alienation, as do books as well. This is just a common shortcut. In film, most of the coding is done via camera work and other design choices, which again were not done in the film, in addition to the actor's expressions and physicality. And in theater, autistic coding is the baseline for pretty much every single character, which means that your physicality has to be really over the top in either direction in order to read as weird and different. And that's doable. That's not an issue. Where it gets trickier is that half of the stims that you can do to make that physicality come off as, wow, they're really different from everybody else in a neurodivergent way, makes you come across to an audience as an awkward 7th grader who's never been in a show before and doesn't quite know what their lines are and doesn't remember how to use their body, and it becomes really uncomfortable for the audience to watch. And not in an ableism way, just in a what's happening, we're in a professional theater kind of way. And again, I know this firsthand. When I was working my thesis after watching through the first dress rehearsal footage of Curious Incident, I just got in my car and I drove and I bought Christopher some stim toys because it was intolerable. It was awful to watch. Avoiding eye contact has to be demonstrated by not even looking at the person. Various stims have to be deliberate and planned and thought through so that they look like deliberate choreography rather than an accident. And you have to figure out how to hold your body in a slightly atypical way the entire time to keep that visual aesthetic of your character going the entire time, rather than just being naturally how you would hold your body. Which is why I always say playing Christopher is one of the hardest things that I've ever done, because I'm really good at masking. I can seamlessly fit into any character, no problem. I can give them autistic pieces and fidgets and all of that. I plan that carefully. But curating my autism to fit a certain theatrical aesthetic while also being sustainable and feeling natural is absolutely beyond difficult. And they didn't talk about this phenomenon in the specifics in Through the Window, but the discussion of curating Evan's tics, as they called them, did come up, so I do know that they did go through the same situation. All of which to say, many critiques of Evan Hansen as a character in the show are in relation to this physicality, a sort of, he doesn't actually represent us, that is tinged with both ableism toward people who do believe that way, not wanting to be grouped in with them, but also lack of understanding about how near impossible it is to pull off what Ben Platt and the other Evan Hansens after him managed to pull off. I should also mention that one of Broadway's Evan Hansens, Taylor Trench, was one of the original Christopher Boones in Curious Incident on Broadway just a few years earlier, so everybody might not have been noticeably aware that Evan was autistic, but they were aware. And then also, Jordan Fisher has now gone on to play Orpheus, who's also autistic coded as hell. So the legacy does exist without people necessarily knowing that the legacy is existing. They also expanded this autistic coding out to other characters. Alana, for example, also struggles to hold conversation and clearly is masking as hard as humanly possible. And in some performances, it's very clear that she wants to feel connected to people, but she just can't connect to people. In others, it's a little bit less clear. I overall wish they'd expanded her character a bit further. I know that they did in the film, but also like film Alana doesn't really have the everything's fine and I'm happy and I'm doing a gazillion things and everything's great and I love that I'm doing stuff and it's totally covering up that I'm falling apart energy that she definitely has in the show. In the film Alana, you look at her and you know she's struggling with something, which would be the new song about like what's hiding underneath the mask, not hit the way that it could have. Also in regards to tropes, her character as it stands accidentally fulfills the over overachiever autistics only use people near them to get what they want because they don't actually want to make friends, they just want to control stuff trope, which is interesting. Jared also very much has a mask, and depending on which performance you look at, it's either really obvious or really, 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 really obvious. I've seen some critiques that he is more cartoon character than person, and that therefore they blame the writing for that fact. I choose to believe that he's trying so hard to seem cool and confident he goes into caricature, and that's just who he is as a person, because it happens. He does fulfill the autistic nerd with bad intentions trope. He also makes a lot of gay jokes, and like, they're kind of outdated now, but whatever. Theater's relationship to queer humor as an industry that has a lot of queers in it is very different from other media. I also very much read Jared as so deeply in the closet that he's trying everything to prove he's not gay, and so his brain translates that to bring up sex at every literal possible moment ever for some reason, which I've known people like that. They did make him actually gay in the movie. I don't think that helps the impact of the dialogue, honestly. But again, part of the autistic coding across the board here is because they're outcast in musical theater, and thus the characterization ends up being practically required in order for that to happen. And honestly, if any character is more autistic in anything other than the show, it would be Connor in the book, because he's more fleshed out. And in the book, Jared and Alana are toned down and become significantly less autistic. Like, you could still read them as autistic if you wanted to, but it's not as glaring. Also, I mentioned tropes with their characters. I don't think those tropes are necessarily harmful, because all tropes are based in some semblance of reality, but they are just things to like ponder and think about. Evan's portrayal of mental illness has also been criticized for making his only personality traits be that he's mentally ill, but I also don't entirely agree with that, not to mention that mental disability literally controls your brain, and your brain controls your personality, so of course it's going to end up being involved in most aspects of your personality. And I also feel like most of the characters in this show are defined by their mental state in this show, because that is what it frames us to pay attention to with the messaging of the story. There's also the discussion to be had that his mental illness equates with his behavior as semi-accidentally self-centered and manipulative, and that it's his disability making him that way, which sort of feeds into the semi-lack of accountability situation, but we'll get to that in a moment. I want to talk for a second about Connor, because of any of the tropes in the show, I think his are the ones that most concern me. So Connor is your stereotypical troubled teen. He does drugs, he looks very, quote, school shooter chic, and he's physically violent, which comes up a few different times throughout the show. And there's been significant research to show that mentally disabled people are statistically both less violent and more likely to be victims of violence. And based on how they fleshed out Connor in the book, he's definitely been a victim of significant violence. And I think the discussions from Zoe about how he was a bad person and what does that mean when it comes to mourning him is important. I think that's a cool and important angle, but I also think that maybe that could have been handled a little bit differently. And actually in the book, when expanding upon Connor, it makes his violence seem more like, oops, that happened, oh well, I didn't mean it, though he did at one point say, I never threatened to kill Zoe. I don't know where she got that from. So they did try to undo a bit of it there, but I think the complexity of seeing him as both an abuser and he was a tortured soul isn't quite handled properly here, especially because all of the he was a tortured soul stuff we know in the show is from Evan's imagination. It's not real. They also make Ghost Connor part of Evan's subconscious, which I'm really into. I think that's really cool, but he does specifically voice all of Evan's darker and more villainous thoughts, which just furthers this trope, and I'm not really a fan of it. I think the book overall handles it better, but it's still rocky because, again, it makes it seem like his violence was an accidental whoopsie-daisy sort of thing. And the nuances of all of this are very, very complicated, and I just don't think the show was entirely up to the task of handling those nuances. The other thing about Connor's character is that they deliberately left him as a sort of enigma for the purpose of getting to know him via the warped post-death exploitation made-up view of him to kind of acknowledge the exploitation of mentally ill people, but by doing so they end up accidentally proving their own point by leaving him as simply an unexplored one-dimensional stereotype. But anyway, back to the whole Evan doesn't take accountability thing. I have complicated thoughts here. First, because what other accountability do you want this man to take? Are we thinking jail time? Do we really want somebody who did something stupid at age 17 have to live with this societal burden of it on his shoulders forever? Or can we trust him to know that it was wrong because he knew it was wrong in the moment and try to do better next time? Because he loses absolutely everything that he gained via the lie, and he has to live with the fact that he caused even more harm for the rest of his life already. And part of what I think is important about his character is that he does hit absolute rock bottom, and then instead of trying to end his life like he tried to the previous summer, he decides to make a different choice and minimize harm going forward, in the same way that Connor's family decides not to out him because that would cause further harm. And I think there's something to be said here about breaking the cycles of harm going on. And also there's discussion to be had about the fact that Zoe effectively thanks him for the lie at the end because, like, they needed it, but I've looked the person who's responsible for my brain damage in the eye and thanked them for being a part of my life, even though it sucked because it made me who I am today. So that doesn't faze me. I think that was actually quite semi-reasonable. That's you know, creating a narrative like that is somewhat healing, and being able to be like, this is a thing that happened and I'm moving on, and acting like it was a semi-positive thing helps them to cope with that, you know? So like that makes a lot of sense to me. I think there is something to be said about the fact that the show itself never entirely holds him accountable, in that like it's not super sure what it wants you to take away from his actions, and I don't think that it has to be one definitive thesis. It could be several different ideas, but I don't think it's quite sure which ideas it wants that to be, if that makes sense. But because it frames him as somebody tragic who we should pity and root for and empathize with all at the same time, it gives the vibe that you're supposed to be on his side of it. But I also think that people don't necessarily know how to handle the concept of a morally gray protagonist who you both love and hate and see yourself in and want to be as distant from as possible all at the same time, because a lot of popular media today is very much like, this is a good guy and this is a bad guy, and the fact that Evan is neither is confusing to some people, and having morally gray characters like this is very common on Broadway and off Broadway, but it is not necessarily common in shows that have gone to the stratosphere like this one did. Like, in the same way that like Hamilton isn't glorifying Hamilton really. Like, you can tell that he kind of sucks the whole time, but then people argue that it is glorifying him, and you know, that's a whole other discussion to be had. But this is actually where I bring in the marketing of the show, because the marketing and the show kind of slowly went in two different directions, and that greatly affects how people do see these characters going into the show. Particularly with the We Are All Evan Hansen campaign and the You Will Be Found campaign. The We Are All Evan Hansen campaign was primarily just to have like short videos that introduce various people involved in creating the show and making it what it is, with the idea that everybody is Evan Hansen in a metaphorical sense, where like it's easy to fall into situations and be too afraid to dig yourself out. It's easy to have the easy conversations rather than the right ones, all of that kind of stuff. But it does create a situation where via the tagline and the idea behind it, they're accidentally saying, disabled people, we're just like you. We eat, we sleep, we have friends, which focuses on these are the things that make you a valid human being, rather than, hey, being different is cool and being comfortable with things that aren't 100% like me is cool, which ends up dehumanizing disabled people more. And all of this also adds up to the accidental glorification of Evan Hansen, which ultimately he's a very messy and great character, which makes audiences go in expecting that goodness from him and expecting to root for him the entire time. And this is a semi-hard critique for me to make, first of all, because I like to presume competence, and I think that people can look at characters who are morally gray and notice how they're feeling about it and come to their own conclusions. The show itself marks Evan as a sort of almost anti-hero who we see fall from grace and then choose a path of healing rather than a path of full destruction. Like, you don't like Evan for a large section of the show. You are drawn to him, but he pisses you off a bit. And I do think that it's interesting that the farther his characterization moves from cute little boy who just messed up into villain territory, the more you start to see that the main villain of this story is the most disabled person of the story, which is an issue. But then the more that he moves toward the cute little boy who just messed up, you see a mentally ill kid whose mental illness is slightly excusing his behavior, which you also don't want narratively. And then, so it's messy on both sides, but I also don't think it is on either side. And then there's also the fact that, like, working non-white, this would look completely different in regards to accountability, but then at the same time, the age group that really connected with this musical is the age group that is just starting to really learn critical thinking skills, so I'm not quite sure if they're going to pick up on any of this, if that makes sense. Like, I presume competence, but I also brain development, you know? But secondly, this is also a hard critique because using autistic coding to create a sort of outsider character we can all relate to has been a thing uncritiqued for literally forever. The first one off the top of my head is Spider-Man. He doesn't go entirely into autistic coding territory, but he's like halfway there. Katniss from the Hunger Games, Hiccup from How to Train Your Dragon. Those are other ones. But I think the impact of this one is different because he is deliberately and canonically disabled. So there is extra weight that he carries as a character, even if he's doing the exact same stuff that we've seen other characters like him do before. This is the first time that we've acknowledged that he's a disabled person. So it carries more responsibility along with it, which is just so interesting and weird, and media is wild. But the other marketing thing is You Will Be Found, which has been critiqued for a while as sort of taking away the agency of like, you'll find your people and things will get better for you in the future, and more like somebody will find you and help you out one day, which is not always what happens. Like, Connor was never found. He died before that happened. Evan wasn't either. He just discovered at the end that his mom was there for him. He just needs to ask her for support. So I guess he's not alone, but that's messy. And I think this song in context is always supposed to be both inspiring and unsettling at the same time. But the thing is, out of context, it means a lot to a lot of people, and they used it a lot in the marketing because it's a fantastic song and a fantastic message, and even more during COVID when everybody was feeling so alone, which then had the accidental side effect of making it seem 100% beautifully, completely genuine in the show, which I don't think it's entirely meant to be because of that association that everybody already had with it from outside of the show. And on one level, I majorly applaud this marketing team for the work they did with the show because they knocked it out of the park. This was something we'd never really seen before, and they deliberately kind of centered it around what the fans were interested in. But some of it did end up accidentally changing some aspects of the narrative when looked at within the context that they were initially created, and I think to the detriment of the piece as it already stood, because it slowly transformed it from this is morally gray to seeming like it was condoning Evan's behavior, when I don't think that they ever meant it to be that way. Other general mental disability things, there's a line where Zoe says her brother's a psychopath. If you're doing a show around mental health, you need to watch your use of disability language. In the film they did change it to be psycho rather than psychopath, which makes it slightly less bad, but still comes off pretty weirdly to an audience. Don't love that it's there. I think I mentioned this earlier, but in case I didn't, it's super valid for Evan to complain about having to do therapist homework and that he feels like his meds and his therapy are attempting to fix him rather than trying to make him like suffer less. And these are valid things, like, you know that I love to critique the psychiatric industrial complex, but they are also very nuanced things that shouldn't just be thrown into conversation, particularly in media like this, particularly media that is, I don't think the target audience was ever 15-year-olds, but it ended up being like 13 to 15-year-olds. But it shouldn't be left completely, wholly uninterrogated. Sincerely Me as a song also sits on the line where we know it's incorrect in what he's saying about how if you try hard enough you'll get better, but also, do we know that it's incorrect on that? And is that an idea we want to keep around unchecked? Like, it's maybe there to show that Evan has no idea what he's doing and is giving kind of bad advice, and it's supposed to show that, but will enough people pick up on that for it to be worth the potential harm that it may cause, you know? There's also the widely talked about situation with his medication. I love that it's in there. I love that we are normalizing that sometimes people take meds, and that's totally fine. That's great gay representation. But there is a moment later in the show where his mom asks if he needs any refills, and he says that he stopped taking them because he doesn't need them anymore, and she's like, so no anxiety? And he's like, yeah, I'm fine. And she gets really excited about that. And now, using the book as a guide, this medication is not his daily SSRI dose, but the as-needed Ativan, which he can just stop taking and be totally fine. I think that should have definitely been clarified if that was initially meant to be the case. Also, the way that this scene is structured implies that he got what he wanted, which was the girl and the family and everything else, and therefore his mental health got better, because if anything, my man really should have been spiraling in this moment because of how much of that was just on shaky ground and he was waiting to be found out. And also, like, given his trait profile, he was probably on a very high dose of an SSRI and therefore needs to safely wean off of that with the support and advice of a physician if he were to go off of that medication. So overall, I think that scene needs to just go away. Another scene that needs to go away, but they did change it for the film, is that Alana tries to call out Evan for lying about the emails by saying that Connor was getting better, so it doesn't make any sense that he killed himself, which, if anything, just a clue they didn't talk to any clinicians when making the show, because depressed people will often do significantly better for a period of time just before taking their own lives because they're excited they have a plan and finally have control over things. And again, I don't necessarily blame them for not talking to clinicians or anything in making the piece, because that wasn't the societal norm at the time. It's a lot more expected now, which is weird to say, but it is a lot more expected now that that would be a thing that somebody would do. Not that theaters do it the majority of the time, but it's at least more expected. They also accidentally set up a sort of inspiration porn burden narrative with this story where the audience can both relate to Evan but also feel like, oh, thank God, at least I'm not that bad situation. And in framing the story through the lens of the moms with Anybody Have a Map, we normally get our disability stories via the caregivers of the disabled people rather than the people themselves. So does this somewhat qualify as that? I don't quite know. They also have brief mentions of Zoe as a glass child, which is the abled sibling of a disabled person who therefore gets less attention, and that's a whole thing. And that's complicated because that very much does happen, but it's also a really common story to put in the media that deliberately frames the disabled sibling as a burden, and so I'm always a bit wary when that idea comes up. And I'm not sure where the show itself stands on this to know where I might stand on this, but I don't think that, not even like, oh, it was handled properly or improperly, I just don't think it was handled, which is just something to note. Another really interesting question here is the idea of the narrative prosthesis, because there's a critique to be made about how the narrative of the main character in this story rests on the narrative of a one-dimensional disabled character. Like, Connor's addiction and suicide prop up Evan's story. But then, if it's one disabled person being the narrative prosthesis for another disabled person, does that cancel out the narrative issue? And I don't know. I've been racking my brain about this for a while, so if you have thoughts on that one, let me know. But some things that I did love. I love how they show that his mental illness is a disability that is actively disabling him, not sort of like some sort of cutesy, oh, I'm so cute and a little quirky mentally ill, or like a I'm just so edgy because I'm mentally ill situation. We don't get that much in media. We also see how it gets in the way of him being able to eat, of being able to take care of himself, of being able to do the things that he wants to do, how it affects his self-esteem. I love how the show handles grief and the question of how do you grieve somebody that you didn't really like? How do you grieve somebody that you're frustrated with? How do you deal with those emotions? It goes into the deep and dark questions about storytelling and whether the factual truth of a story matters more than the emotional truth of it. And it discusses to what degree do the ends justify the means, if ever. And it also shows like how we deliberately like destroy the privacy of the dead in order to get our like goals or like what we want from the death to make that death have meaning. And does that actually help the help remember the dead person the way that they want to be remembered, you know? At the end of the day, Dear Evan Hansen's a period piece. As I said earlier, mental disability conversations have changed exponentially since this time, as has social media, so anything centered around either or both of those things was destined to age absolutely terribly. It had no chance. Yes, there's critique to be had about the fact that the show got praised for simply bringing up a taboo subject and not really delving into it, but then as we learned from the Who's Tommy video, that is a specific kind of art that also needs to exist. Like, you need topics to come up and settle around you before you can comfortably engage in conversation around them. And I think this show did create that space in the theatrical setting, not necessarily in film or in the book settings, because that conversation had already been opened in those two settings. The musical shows that mental illness is real and common and people struggle with it in different ways and present differently. It really resonated with a whole lot of people who'd never seen themselves represented on stage before in this medium. And also, speaking about medium in particular is super important because the arts handles mental disability in a very specific and super toxic way that doesn't really carry over to other fields, which is the idea that you are a good artist because of your mental disability, and therefore being mentally disabled is an asset, and labeling it and trying to help yourself is actually harmful. And anytime you try to bring it up to talk to people about it, they tell you how you're going to create cool art from it, and you're so lucky to feel that way. Much of my undergrad thesis was figuring out how to unpack that idea in the theater realm and how the arts can be healthier around the concepts of mental health. So this show, with that context, becomes extra important. And I know it's hard to believe that something from 2016 could be considered a period piece, but a lot of the critiques around Dear Evan Hansen are looking at them through a very modern lens around disability and accountability and storytelling more generally, which is just unhelpful and also unfair. Because at the time, it created the representation so many people were so very much craving, and it really spoke to people, particularly young people. Because this plus Hamilton are probably the gateway show for maybe a third of the young people that I meet, and people in general tend to really hate on gateway shows for being like low art or whatever. Like, there's a sort of implication that if lots of young people like something, it's therefore not well constructed. And particularly with this one, which then won a whole ton of Tonys over the more technically impressive shows the year after Hamilton completely swept the Tonys. There were a lot of discussions about award sweeps and whether that's okay and whatnot after that, which led to more industry folk not necessarily liking the show. But at the end of the day, depressed teenagers who like musical theater are going to attach themselves to a musical about depressed teenagers. It's just going to happen. And because the show also acknowledged the difficulties of parenting those depressed teenagers, the parents also felt really seen. And because mental health issues are on the rise because of capitalism, which is a whole other disability rights thing I'm not going to get into right now, that leaves a large portion of the population in the direct target demographic for this show. And yes, some people are going to leave it and not feel represented because they heard it was going to feel like watching themselves on stage and they didn't personally feel that way, and so they left frustrated saying it's bad representation. But if the majority of your audience says they feel seen and heard for the first time, you've done a good thing. And I'm not saying the show is perfect. I also didn't have my Dear Evan Hansen phase until like 2019, and I never saw the show. I was solely based on the music. So I don't really have skin in the game here. I'm not like defending it because I was obsessed with it when I was 12. But I do think that we need to remind ourselves that this show was a massive step in the right direction. And it was, therefore, going to be messy and rocky as hell. And the fact that it wasn't messier than it currently is honestly astonishing to me, because it could have aged way worse than it did. Frankly, I thought it was worse than it was going to be, and I watched it. I was like, this isn't causing this much problems. I don't think it's the worst. I'm also very tired of people hating on shows just because the primary audience is under the age of 16. That's just not cool. But in regards to how to stage future Evan Hansens, I don't think there's a lot that can be done in regards to staging that could make it less harmful without active script changes. I think an authentically autistic Evan at some point it would be cool, but also would directly acknowledging that accidentally end up condoning other parts of the piece we don't want condoned, you know, because people feel like, oh, they cast an autistic person so the show is therefore fine, when it still has other things that it has problems with. In regards to the script, I would take out the Connor being violent and reframe that a little bit. Like, Zoe can be mad at him because they used to be best friends and then he stopped talking to her and stopped being interested in her. That would be better. That would also be just as accurate for whatever he was going through and would have less stigma. I would also take out the word psychopath the one time that it's used. I think the medication situation needs some work or to be cut entirely, and I would like to expand upon some of the things in the book by putting them into the show, but then again that would be difficult with the runtime because of the songs and whatnot, so this gets really complicated really quickly. But those would be my few off the top of my head changes. But overall, I do think this is one of those shows where we can be like, you know what? You had a really important impact on the history of theater, and we're gonna leave it as it is and not really perform it anymore. Like, some of the other things I've analyzed in this series have been in the cultural consciousness as stories for 50 to 100 years. In Hunchback's example, hundreds of years. And so they're always going to be in the cultural consciousness, and we really can't erase them, so we need to really work with them. But the way that this story works is very hyper-specific to a very certain window of time that I don't think would really translate 100 years from now, or 50 years from now, or even 20 years from now. And that's not an indictment of the quality of the show, it's just the reality of the kind of story that it's telling and how the perception of that is going to evolve over time, you know? But yeah, I think that's all that I have. I know this is a little bit shorter than my other dramaturgy deep dives, but this also is the least history heavy piece I've had to look at thus far, and it's been nice. I've enjoyed not having to, like, read a gazillion things. But if you want more recent musicals that have Dear Evan Hansen energy but aren't specifically Dear Evan Hansen to carry you along, Between the Lines, which is off-Broadway last summer, had a lot of the same autistic-coded high schoolers struggling to navigate school and change and rocky family life, but she copes with it by hiding in books and wishing to become a part of a fairy tale, and then she learns how to handle scary things on her own via what she learns from the books. It's really great. The music is incredible. The vibes are immaculate, so go check out their cast recording if you want that. You should. Not that I'm a little bit biased because I know a lot of the creative team of that show, but it is a really good show and I highly recommend it. There's also a Pro Shot that they made that isn't out yet, but one day it will be out and I will post about it on Instagram when it is out, so keep an eye out for that. And if you want a musical that centers a morally great character who you root for but then suddenly realize he actually sucks, that's really great commentary on gender politics and the nature of storytelling and truth. The Connector with music by Jason Robert Brown, who consistently writes masterpieces, recently closed its off-Broadway run. Their cast album is going to be out in June. I highly recommend it. Also, Ben Levi Ross, a former Evan, plays the leading character, so you'll get the same energy on the vocals that you get from Dear Evan Hansen. But yeah, both of those shows feel like pieces of theater that could not have existed in the way that they do exist without the existence of Dear Evan Hansen, and that feels really cool to me. Because I love seeing the legacy of storytelling. But anyway, sources are linked below. You can check them out if you want to. Don't if you don't. Let me know what you think about all this in the comments. Also, go read the book. I'm serious. Go read the book. Tell me what you think. It'll probably make its way into my autism series at some point because it was just that good, genuinely. But yeah, as always, thank you for listening. Thank you for learning. Remember, it's never too late to start over, and also critical thinking is sexy. And I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.